Hi there everyone. Welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Dogen Zenji on the point. You might have noticed if you've done the reading that Dogen quite enigmatically refers to the point of all things, right? And so we're going to be investigating and trying to understand what it is that he means by this. So to begin with, Dogen was the founder of the Soto school of Zen Buddhism in the 13th century. Now, I know that is a lot of information to absorb all at once, so let's break it down. Buddhism is a religion and a philosophy that developed out of India whose central problem is the ubiquity of suffering in the world. All people, all creatures have to suffer. And there are no surefire strategies in the world for avoiding suffering. And so Buddhism emerges as a philosophical project to understand and diminish the nature of suffering to the greatest degree possible. It's quite interesting, to look at Buddhism by comparison with some of the philosophers that we've examined up until this point to just see how radically different forms of philosophy have taken around the world. In this case, Buddhism traveled all the way from India into China, which eventually formed its own school of Chan Buddhism, which would eventually become Zen Buddhism in Japan. Now, Zen Buddhism is unique in its way of approaching the problem of the ubiquity of suffering. In general, what the Zen Buddhists are going to say is that the real way to end this cycle of suffering is to adopt the correct kind of theoretical stance towards the world, right? If you know the nature of suffering, you know why things had to be the way that they are, then you will feel less anxiety about suffering and you will be able to deal with suffering better than others. Within Zen Buddhism, there are kind of two schools of thought which pointed to two different kinds of practices in order to reach this theoretical stance towards the world. The first, the one that predated Dogen, is known as the Rinzai school, right? And in essence, this was a school of Zen Buddhism that really sought to come to understand the nature of suffering through what are known as koans, as we're going to discuss in a moment. A koan is like a paradoxical puzzle. So, for example, one koan that would be shared in a Japanese Buddhist monastic kind of setting would describe various kinds of behavior by enlightened Zen monks that we have trouble understand, right? So one example of a koan is, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. Right? So what's the idea here, right? That the puzzle is to try to understand why it is that Buddhism requires that you go out and you kill the Buddha that you see on the road, right? There are lots of different interpretations of this koan. Some of them really emphasize that you're not supposed to find the Buddha in the external world, but you're supposed to find the Buddha within. Others say that what's going on is a rejection of sort of lay or conventional understandings of Buddhism, and so on. There are lots of different kinds of interpretations, right? And so the way that you would display your Zen mastery is that your master in a monastic setting would present you with this kind of koan, and you would reply in a way that demonstrated your understanding in one way or another. Now, Dogen actually breaks with this understanding of Zen Buddhism. And instead, the Soto school doesn't think that koans are the way to achieve enlightenment. Instead, the way to achieve enlightenment, according to the Soto school, is what's known as zazen, which is just sitting peacefully. So this is a kind of Zen Buddhism that thinks that you achieve this theoretical stance towards the world that diminishes your suffering to the greatest extent possible through the practice of sitting meditation. So just as a fun story, of course, I'm a philosopher, so I'm quite interested in Zen Buddhism, Zen Buddhist practice. It's very interesting that here in Albuquerque, we actually have a Zen center. They also have one up in Santa Fe. And I was excited because they were going to have a speaker who was the translator of actually the text that you all are reading now. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to have to try to go up to Santa Fe so that I can hear this guy talk, right? But there was no talking. It was actually just many, many, many hours of guided, silent, sitting meditation with this Zen master, right? So they mean it, right? You actually gain enlightenment through practicing sitting meditation, right? And today we're really going to try to draw out what are like the very interesting philosophical aspects of this point of view. So we're going to see that in Dogen, just to give the point away, right? What is the point? The point is practice. Right? Practice is the way that we come to adopt an enlightened stance towards the world, right? An unreflective practice, right? And it's quite interesting that, Dogen has a number of texts of different sorts, right? But he writes, for example, about how to do the dishes correctly, right? Doing the dishes is just one example of a kind of practice where if done correctly, it can lead you into the kind of meditative state that Dogen is interested in. So here are just some terms that I think will help you understand Dogen and the reading. The first is nirvana, right? What's the meaning of nirvana? It's enlightenment, right? This is that theoretical stance towards the world that reduces your suffering towards the world. Buddhism, quite generally, says that the way to reach enlightenment is to free yourself of desire and attachment, right? And so Dogen is going to argue that you free yourself of desire and attachment in meditative practices like zazen. As we discussed, a koan is sort of a paradoxical poem, right? And zazen is the practice of meditation. You're also going to see this term Buddha Dharma show up a lot in the reading, and this just means like fundamental reality, right? And so a lot of the text is going to compare you to the Buddha precisely to the extent that you understand Buddha Dharma, right? Okay, now let's look at two rather large quotes. These are obviously both from Dogen. Right, and also I should have mentioned this earlier. In Japanese, you say the surname first, right, and then you say the first name second. So in calling him Dogen, I'm not being overly familiar or something like that, right? Anyway, okay. So these are both quotes by Dogen. Quote. To carry the self forward and illuminate various things is delusion. That the myriad things come forward and illuminate the self is awakening. Okay, let's pause here. The basic point here is, I think, relatively easy to see, right? When you're projecting your own categories, your own desires onto the nature of things, that's where you run into delusion, right? That's where you can run into really serious problems about your relationship to the world, right? Desire would be an example of carrying the self forward and using that to illuminate various things. By contrast, myriad things coming forward and illuminating the self is awakening. So we discover the self not by like introspecting really hard, right? Looking at our own self-consciousness, as it were, but we discover the essential nature of the self in activity, right? Through our engagement with various things. Okay, Dogen moves on. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily know they are Buddhas. I want to particularly emphasize that last line, right? In other words, what Dogen is describing as enlightenment or nirvana is not the sort of thing that a philosopher does whenever they think really hard about their favorite view of reality, right? As I mentioned, it's not self-conscious awareness or developing like this whole big theory about the nature of the world that leads to enlightenment. To the contrary, those who are truly Buddhas, those who have realization about delusion and so on, don't actually self-consciously realize themselves as Buddhas. So in other words, we are closer to the truth when we are in the zone, right? So for example, if you're doing the dishes and you're not thinking about anything at all and you're just allowing yourself to do the activity, right? Or similarly, say that you're an athlete and you are at a competition or a tournament, right? And you let all of that other stuff sort of wash over you and you just get into the sheer fact of playing the game, right? It's when you can do that, it's when you can lock in to that non-reflective state where you are purely present that you are like the Buddha, right? It's at that point that delusion and desire have gone away, right? And Zazen, as a meditative practice, is deliberately designed to bring you to the state of pre-reflective awareness. That's where the enlightenment is, right? Not having the most subtle or sophisticated understanding of a koan or something like that, right? But instead in the practice of meditation, where you have this unreflective awareness. This view is expressed also in the second quote by Dogen, quote, "There is a simple way to become a Buddha. When you refrain from unwholesome actions, are not attached to birth or death, and are compassionate to all sentient beings, respectful to seniors and kind to juniors, not excluding or desiring anything, with no thoughts or worries, you will be called a Buddha. Seek nothing else." So Dogen, quite like Socrates earlier, argues that we should not fear death, nor should we desire birth or continued life, right? Desire is a way to enter that sort of reflective state, right? We are trying to stick with the truth of the unreflective, practical state, right? It's precisely when we don't desire anything, when we don't care about birth or death, right, that we are rightly called a Buddha. Life, on Dogen's perspective, as I understand him, is all about those little moments where you can truly be yourself and truly be present in the moment without thinking about the meaning of your life, without thinking about the things that you need or desire or suffer for, and can simply be there with the myriad things of your environment. I hope that you've enjoyed this very, very short, very, very brief introduction to Buddhism and Dogen. Do you agree with him that we should release ourselves of all desires so as to release ourselves from needless suffering? Do you disagree with him? I'm so interested in learning what you think. And I will see you in the next video. We will continue on our Socrates journey together.